You are about to receive messages that may be harmful to your mental state. Your sense of reality will be questioned. Your view on things will be altered. You are now part of the meta. The meta controls everything. The meta determines what will and will not happen. You are watching The Meta Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Meta Show. It is May the 2nd, 2020. You may have noticed a couple of things differently here. My name is Wolf Blitz, Briskerball. I am your co-host, alongside not the Matani this week. Instead, this week we are joined by producer January Valentine.
Hello.
And everybody's favorite Karma Fleet CEO, Merkel Chen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Super happy to be here with you.
So we are not able to bring you the Matani this week because he decided that he had something better to do than the Meta Show, which is go on vacation and stay the hell away from everybody else. So that's what he's doing this week. So that's his loss, but our gain, because we get to put our favorite producer January on, as well as Merk, who has been on the show before, but who sometimes gets to fill in for Mittens, and that's always fun. So are you excited?
I'm very excited.
I can tell.
I'm going to have trouble holding back, as a matter of fact. When our mama's not around, we will misbehave. It's going to be ugly.
The excitement, I think I'm ready. I got the beard going. I think we're ready to go. We're doing a little bit of a different concept for the show this week. Obviously, one of the things that we were trying to figure out is what kind of interesting different types of shows we could do. There is a little bit of EVE news this week, not a lot of CCP side, but some in-game side. We may get to that later. But the big news in the community is applications for CSM 15 open this week. And as a result of that, I thought it would be a good idea for us to go back and do a show talking about the CSM. Not so much who's running now and why we like this person or why we like that person, but what it is, how it got to be what it is today, the history of it, and the players and stories and things that all came around the CSM. Because I feel like EVE is one of the only games where you have this kind of a democratically elected body of the players who get to go and hang out with the developers and tell them what the community thinks. No other game has that. Even games that have player representatives and stuff, typically they're chosen by the community, not by the community, but by the company. In this case, they're chosen by the community, so that's different. So I wanted to talk about that, and since we've had 15 CSMs going back all the way to 2008, I thought we'd get a bunch of folks who have been on various CSMs, some folks you know, some folks who are making their Meta Show debuts today, and get them in here and talk about this kind of stuff. So are you guys ready to go? You want to hear more about this?
What a storied organization the CSM is. You know, you think about all the people that have shit up those hollowed halls in beautiful sunny Reykjavik, Iceland, and what an incredible group to say you've been a part of. Isn't it? Your experience maybe a little different the first time around than most, but makes for a really, really good story.
Yeah, I'm kind of hoping that in the event that I actually make this happen again, that the ending is a little better than the last time, but we'll see. But anyway, we're going to get our top story started. We're going to bring our crew on so we can talk all things CSM, the history of the CSM, and where we think it's going in the future. That's our top story today. All right, everybody, welcome back. I want to introduce, we have a very, very long and distinguished panel of guests today from all across New Eden, from various CSMs going back all the way to CSM 2, even though he doesn't want to admit that he was on it. So let me introduce everybody, and then we'll get in and we'll start talking. From CSM 2 and CSM 14, we have Villy of Test Alliance Please Ignore.
Hello.
Some would say, Ray.
Gotta throw the taffy jokes in, right? From CSM 4 and CSM 7, we have Alexiev Card of the Network and Noir Mercenary Group.
Hello, everybody.
From CSM 8, 10, 12, 13, and 14, and the man who almost invariably replaces an NC Dot member when they resign from the CSM, it's Sword Dragon.
Hey guys. Hey guys.
Dunk Dinkle from CSM 14.
Afternoon, party people.
And last but not least, from CSM's 11, 12, 13, and 14, Innominate of Goonswarm.
Hey, everyone.
So, for the record, just so you guys are aware, we wanted to do this show. It was going to be about CSM, the history of the CSM, about different types of people, different people who have been on it, and how it's changed over the years. Just a caveat, we do have a number of people who are running for CSM this year that are on the show. I just want to get this out of the way so nobody says this is just a show to broadcast the people who are running. It's not. We really want to talk about the history. But Villy, Innominate, myself, January, and Merc are all candidates who are going to be standing for CSM 15. So that's out of the way. Now we can start talking about like legitimate stuff. Merc, are you standing? That's the first question that the audience has.
I am standing. I feel you're going to see me shifting a lot more than I probably should be. I have trouble determining what it is I should do with these things, but I'll try to just sit in one place to make it easy, because I noticed I was launching off frame a minute ago. I'll do better. Thank you for bringing me.
You're okay. Dunk is doing the same thing. He's standing up too, aren't you? You guys have standing desks. It's weird.
Of course we have standing desks because we live in this century.
Okay. All right. I just like to sit down while I do the show. What can I say? All right. So to get things started, the CSM has been around since 2008, and we went back and looked at a lot of the historical data about it, and it really has changed considerably from when it started. Villy, you were on CSM 2. Do you remember anything about what it was like to be on in that early days of the CSM, and what kind of experience do you remember having when you were there?
Well, the old CSM, I remember like losing in the election, which was pretty heartbreaking at the time. You know, I was in a small gang group, and I think I only got like 500 votes, and I campaigned really, really hard for those votes, and I was like answering every question, being every bro. I remember in the thread, like, you know, why do you feel you're justified to be on the CSM? And I'm like, I have 3 years of experience playing EVE Online. I think I know a little bit, okay? You know, so, you know, contextually nowadays it's like, you know, who knows? But, you know, that was in 2008, I think, so it was a very different time. But all of the meetings were in-game channel. They were run by a GM. Obviously, it was following some of the things that caused the creation of the CSM, so some of those issues were still being discussed. I was an alternate at the time, and the CSM had an alternate system, so if one of the main members dropped out, you know, alternate 1 would come pick up, and I think I was alternate 2 or 3, I can't remember now. But basically, there was no real hope of me being needed, but, you know, you stick around, you're in the meetings, it's cool, you get to hear the cool shit. But obviously I was never needed, and once the summit started, I was mostly closed out of like the loop of like the really cool shit that was going on. But the CSM back in those days was very much a different institution almost, because the people who ran for it were not. It's very interesting because, you know, many people complain about, you know, the no blocks controlling so much of the CSM now, but when you look back at the CSM of that age and that era, the CSM was very much controlled by HiSec, and it was a very different, it was just very different as a council in terms of the way it operated and the people who were on it and the way they interacted with each other, just because they're such, how do I put this? The gamers of HiSec are so disconnected from each other in a way, so they're not the communal organizers that many of the CSM members you have nowadays are. So the way which they interacted was very different, and it was just a very different time. And I mean, I look back at some of the names now, and I'm like, wow, these people are like kind of like the little famous players of that time. But you know, they were all famous like industrial players, or they were famous for making a video or that kind of things. And compared to now, the name recognition is so different in terms of how players earn it. Like some of them were famous because they were like big Evo forum posters. Like that was a big thing back then. You know, so it was just a very different style and a very different council with very different personalities compared to what you see nowadays.
They could still shake hands while campaigning. It was a totally different world than we live in today.
Exactly right. So let me go back, and to Villy's point, I think it's important that, you know, we lay out the history. I don't know. We have a lot of different players, a lot of players that have started in EVE since 2008 and may not be familiar with what it is that essentially was the impetus for the creation of the CSM. So let me lay out the story. Essentially what happened was in 2008, there was a CCP developer named CCP T20. He was a member of the Band of Brothers Alliance. And what happened was, back then there was a way of getting BPOs, and it was through a lottery system that the developers created, and they were randomly distributed to people across the game. And that's how Blueprint Originals were introduced into the game. He was, and had apparently created a couple of BPOs that were very, very, very desirable, including, I believe it was a Saber BPO that everybody needed and wanted. And he gave it specifically to his band of brother friends, and he used developer tools to do that. This came out because someone hacked the Bob forums in Goonswarm and got the information and publicized it, and it became a huge outcry in the community. And the result was, among other things, the creation of an internal affairs department at CCP that covers internal stuff for both the players as well as the developers, but also the creation of this Council of Stellar Management, which they had toyed with for a number of years prior, but finally didn't pull the trigger on until 2008. And that was the creation of the CSM. The original CSM, as it was originally envisioned, is completely different from what it is now. And we can go into that a little bit later, but I want to tell you about how it was set up back then. The terms for the CSM were 6 months at a time, not a year like it is today. There were 2 CSMs in 2008. There were CSM 1 and CSM 2. The election was done. It was just a first past the post system. Whoever got the most votes was on. The top vote getter became the chairman. Then the rest of the members elected a vice chair, a secretary, and a vice secretary. The secretary was supposed to take all the notes and do all the minutes. And they actually voted on proposals that players would make and put into the Jita Park and the Assembly Hall sections of the EVO forums. And you'd have to get a certain number of votes before the CSM would even pass the proposals on to the development team. Which
My
is
Lord, what a
completely
shit
different.
that sounds like.
Can you imagine?
And people complain about Goonswarm being bureaucratic.
Right?
It was exactly as bad as it sounds. It was terrible.
I mean, Alec, tell us about how bad that was, because it sounds like it's crazy to me. I can't imagine how you guys operated under that.
Yeah, this was the bulk of my time on CSM4 was around proposals. We had these weekly or bi-weekly, I think it was weekly meetings. And that was really the only time the members in the CSM talked was at these weekly meetings. There was no joint chat. There was no Discord or Slack like you have nowadays. There definitely wasn't any constant communication with the development team. We didn't talk to them until we got to the summit, basically. So we would take these player proposals, which we had been looking at throughout the week. Ones that had sufficient support got brought up in these meetings where we would discuss and vote on them. And then we bundled them all up and we took them out to the summit, and they wound up not mattering at all because the summit agenda was set by CCP, and we didn't really have a ton of input into it. I think we brought up a few things, and they ultimately, I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't recall any of them going anywhere.
Right. It sort of seems like two pathways for precisely the same thing to happen. Whereas in that era, you guys sort of did more of a committee approach where you decided we're going to run this up the flagpole. This is going to be our go-to thing. Usually CCP has ideas of their own for things that they're working on and are more interested in feedback for that. Whereas now each individual candidate certainly does have pet projects that they're going to bring to the table, but it always seems to jive just a little bit better if the candidate group can say, you know what, this is really important. Here's another thing that's really important. Let's run with those when we get to Reykjavik, but let's, we'll all obviously mention the little things that we ran on for our individual platforms. Was it ever effective? Were there any ideas that you guys came up with through the committee approach that had the support of the players as well, that you felt like you got a good return on the investment as far as bringing it up?
And there were definitely some proposals that were very popular. Again, I could be wrong, it was a very long time ago, but I don't recall any of them actually resulting, say, in a game change or anything of that nature. Our pet projects had a bit more traction. One of them was the switch to the single-year term, which was pioneered by Elvin Lord and his vice chair, who I cannot forget the name of, and I apologize. But they came up with this idea mid-summit, basically. I don't know, maybe they had ideas about it beforehand, but that was our big after day one objective. It was like, man, we're not getting anything done out here. Like, what's one thing we could do that would actually move the needle for a future CSM? And so they came up with this 1-year term proposal, and we pretty much put all our political capital into making that happen. The only other thing I can recall being like good bang for the buck was part of my election campaign at the time involved improved responsiveness from the GM and support team. So they were kind of infamous at the time for doing the boilerplate responses, but also still taking forever to do them. So I managed to secure a meeting on the agenda with the GM and customer support team. We kind of took them to task, and improvements were like visibly happening from those conversations. Beyond those two things, I don't think we really got anything we wanted that CCP didn't already want to do to happen.
That's just crazy.
Companies love that though, when you're like, okay, hi, we're part of your focus group and we don't want you, we're here to ask you the questions, you know, like
Right.
about those
Don't tell us
GM
anything.
ticket times. Let's talk.
So if the CSM was put together because of this developer doing something illegal in the game, do you feel that the earlier CSMs didn't live up to like why there was a CSM to begin with? And do you feel that way now? And this is mostly for Villy, Alec, and Sort, because you've kind of had the spread between 2, 4, 7, and now 13 and 14.
I think definitely there was a focus. I know in CSM2 because like I actually kind of kept all of the chat logs, I guess, of the meetings, and like there was still kind of discussion about that kind of subject. So it was definitely still something that we had, were concerned about, etc. And it's not like there has been there hasn't really been an issue since. So to say that the CSM didn't accomplish that mission to me is a little unfair. I don't know if the CSM. Well, the thing is, once you've accomplished that objective, your secondary objective becomes much more your primary, right? So, if CCP is not committing malfeasance, then, let's focus on just making CCP better. So I think that generally became the players' focus a little more, and over time, it's obviously become much more that. But at the time, it's much more one of those things where, okay, so, I think from CCP side, yeah, we're not doing anything dumb. These players, they have opinions. Let's put them in a corner and we'll listen to them. And if somebody does something stupid, then we have somebody to say, we talked to about first. I definitely feel like early on, the meetings were much more, as people have described, like a focus group where you just, if you want something, maybe you ask them and maybe you pay attention to what they say or not. Compared to what I've seen now, which is a much more in-depth, much more utilization of the CSM comparatively.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I want to throw this to Sort too, because I feel like the whole idea around the CSM originally seemed to be there was some kind of an oversight role, but given the fact that even the first CSMs were signing NDAs, it doesn't seem like it'd be really possible for this council to really hold the company accountable, because the only way really to do that would be to tell the players, hey, these guys are screwing up, because otherwise there's no real carrot or stick. There's no stick to get them to change their opinion. If you can't tell everybody what they're doing wrong because you're barred from the NDA from sharing it if you find out about it, then how do you hold them accountable? So that never made any sense to me. Sort, did you feel like that was part of the role when you got on an 8, that there was any of that accountability role left, or had that all kind of fallen by the wayside? You're on mute. Unmute yourself.
So I think one thing that probably Villy doesn't remember was the time Monocle Gate. So Monocle Gate was used by the CSM. CSM was called in. I mean, Alec can probably talk to that. But the reality is that there has always been the need for it. CCP has just gotten better at hiding stuff behind the NDA when they use the CSM. And and if anything bad happens, they'll just shut it down behind a wall, and then you'll have an emergency meeting. Over multiple CSMs, you would see that we're going to have this meeting today, and it's going to be about this thing that came out on the forums, or this change that we did, or boot.ini, for example, or lots of different things where they would call people into a meeting, but it would never make it out to the public space. So there was always a need for the CSM like that. But the one thing that I would say with the transition of the membership was that after like CSM 2 and 3 and 4, where people started to be worried less about what CCP was doing, CSM candidates started coming along being this big, I'm advocating for this, I'm advocating for this, I'm advocating for this. And nowadays, it's gotten long enough that the CSMs now know that they're coming in not to advocate for something, but mostly to try and stop CCP from doing something that they think they shouldn't do.
Now, Nam, was that your experience too on from 11 on?
Yes, actually, quite a lot. The like Sort said, I agree that the main purpose of the CSM is sort of to act as to provide oversight, and like Sort said, the CCP has over the past few years worked with the CSM on a lot of this, and I mean it works. There have been a number of things which would have been terrible if they went forward, which the CCP and the CSM worked together, and it wound up not happening. And so it's the whole thing works better because it's not hitting the public that much. These things aren't actually being released to create a shitstorm. They're working with the CSM, and the oversight role is working.
I mean, one thing that comes to mind on 7, we got pulled into a meeting where the TLDR of it was, this is after John Lander had departed. This was going to be the first patch post John Lander. It was the EVP for a while. They wanted to do the in-game fitting tool, which is wonderful, but in a much more limited scope than we know it today. And they basically wanted it to be effectively the entirety, give or take 1 or 2 smaller tweaks, of a 6-month release. And we we had a meeting with CCP, and they're like, well, here's what you think of this. And I'm like, can we get back to you? And then we hung up, and we got back on a call all together without the CCP folks, and everyone else was like, did you guys hear that?
We could probably get away with that for like a 2-week thing today, but I don't think they could do it for a 6-month iteration, 6-month expand. Hey, we're going to give you guys a new expansion. All it is a fitting tool.
Right. Exactly. Alexia, I have a question about that, though. That's interesting to me because our interaction with CCP today, at least the way that the council interacts, is extremely broad. Like, you could be talking to people from the marketing team, you could be talking to people from the GM team, you could be speaking to the senior leadership of the company. You're obviously very, very interactive with the community team. What were the main points of contact for you guys? And did you have that kind of broad base of people that your interactions were with from the company itself?
Well, like 6 and 7 were kind of the CSMs where that first really started. 4 definitely didn't exist. I think 5 was maybe starting to experiment with it, and I wasn't on it, so this is all, just information I've gotten from conversation with Minxie and other people that were on 5. I got the sense they were still kind of held at arm's length a little bit. I think Monocle Gate kind of forced that change in a lot of ways. So 6 and 7, we started to get more access, not just to developers, but also to the broader company in general. It was still very heavily developer focused at 7. We would occasionally get access to senior leadership outside the summits. This meeting was one of those times. We managed to translate the outcome of that meeting into a CSM proposed patch where we took feature ideas that we knew CCP had on the backlog, and we're like, okay, let's shine a few of these up, and let's pitch the idea of theming releases rather than just having one single Jesus feature. Let's have a couple features that kind of work together, synergize somehow, and that speak to older players and newer players, a little bit of everything. and let's try to get them out of this 6 month or put a patch out, nothing for 6 months, put a patch out, nothing for 6 months, put a patch out, and let's try to shake that tree a little bit. And we wound up basically putting the entire back half of our term into that. And since then, the CCP release schedule and how they think about patches has undergone a lot of revisions, but it wasn't even a conversation before we pushed that. So we didn't actually we didn't really have like direct access or influence necessarily over what they wound up doing with it, but at least they were listening to us about the idea. And it was kind of this transition period internally within CCP where they had a leadership switch. They didn't really have a clear roadmap direction at the time. And we were just able to kind of get in there and go, hey, it's not necessarily the feature, but there's something up with your process. And you kind of move the focus away from what is like the feature that's going to save Eve to how can we build patches that are going to be more robust and get more engagement from players over time.
So one of the things that I think is interesting to throw out there. I'm sorry, was somebody going to say something?
I was just talking about how they communicated on 8, which was my first term. They started using Skype, and originally it was every CSM member and every CSM member and every CCP member in a Skype channel, and everyone would just type. And then towards the end of CSM 8, they actually started to put actual team channels.
Oh,
and
nice.
it was an absolute nightmare, because Skype didn't function well to begin with. And then by the time we got to CSM 10, we moved on to, I don't think it was Slack we used. Steve would have to tell me, I can't remember the exact program we used. But, and then now we're in progression of Slack. But the difference is, it also helped at a CSM level. So in CSM 8, we actually had channels, so we were live typing to each other during meetings where we had problems. And it made it a little bit interesting to give feedback, basically.
So it sounds to me, based on the history that I was looking at when I started this, that there have been certain eras, and it seems like each of those eras was defined by some big giant blow up that caused all kinds of problems that ended up resulting in a bunch of stuff. So CSM 1 obviously was a T20 incident, and then CSM 5, it seems like that kind of became when they changed to the 1-year format, and you had the first person that was removed for an NDA violation, and then you had multiple people resign from that CSM. CSM 6, you have the Summer of Rage. That becomes a huge thing. That's Monocle Gate. For those of you who weren't aware, CSM 6, what happened then was CCP published an article in their in their Insider magazine talking about monetization and how people would pay a lot of real life money for things like a monocle or a pair of jeans or something they could put. It was like on the cutting edge of monetization in MMOs, and the community went insane about it. And that became like a huge deal, and I think it resulted in some major changes. And that was the CSM that Matani was on, and a number of, Elise Randolph was on. We wanted to get Elise on the show because I really wanted to talk to him about that, to see what it was like being on there during that time period. And then Celine currently from MC, he was with Cascade Imminent back then, took over as chairman when Mittens was removed because the Wizard had an incident at FanFest. So there was all kinds of stuff like that happened in that transition from CSM 6 to CSM 7. There was also, I think, CSM 8, we had a number of changes. And that was the first. Say that again?
Summer Blink was CSM 8.
Right. Summer Blink was CSM 8, and then CSM 8 also saw major changes to the voting system. This was the first CSM that had the single transferable vote system, and then they made you guys do a pre-election where you had to get like 200 endorsements of people to even get on the ballot. Can you talk about how bad that was, or what that was like, switching from the old system to the new system of voting? Did people figure it out?
So the STV came from the chairman of years before called Trebor. I can't remember his last name, but Trebor was the guy that advocated for the STV vote. You primarily beforehand had to get 2,000, I think it was 2,000 likes on your forum post to get to be considered a candidate. And then afterwards, it was a 200 man pre-election, and it's hard enough to get players to vote once, to actually vote twice, and a lot of people had no clue what was going on, and so it was a gigantic shit show, basically.
That's interesting. January, you have a question?
Yeah, how do you feel about... I'm not sure how to say this. So it seemed like not the last CSM was kind of political. It felt like there were there was a lot of tensions between certain members outside the CSM. Has that always been the case where there was always that kind of political... I'm not talking about the our two guests here, but another person. But have you felt like that was the case in previous CSMs? Were there always in-game tensions that would come out at the summit or at meetings or at any point?
Certainly the early CSMs, no. In fact, I was very surprised about that fact. On CSM 4, we had 2 Goonswarm reps, Trisvik and Zastro, and in the proposal period, they would either never show up to meetings, or if they did show up to meetings, it would just be trolly. And I was like, okay, here we go. And we had people from the old Northern Coalition, before there was an alliance of the same name, that were actually leading the council, people from Morsis Mihi and Razor and stuff. So I expected once we got to the summit that they would just be goofing off and getting into arguments with these guys. But actually, once we hit the summit, they were some of the most articulate and passionate people involved in the entire proceeding. In fact, my best memory from CSM 4 is when Zaster literally slammed his hand on the table 3 or 4 times, talking about Dominion Sov, which had recently rolled out. And still was very buggy and very grindy. Some of the bugs got fixed, the grind never did. And I was just blown away by how engaged and responsible and team playery they both were. And 7, I don't recall any political disagreements of any kind. The biggest disagreements were really around activity, because we had 12, 14 people in the CSM, and of those, 3 to 4 were reliably active, and you could maybe throw in Celine there when he wanted to check in. That was basically the whole CSM boiled down to about 3 people, 3.5 people. by month 2, month 3, it was like that.
That's scary.
So that was where most of our arguments came from, either us, arguing with people that they should be more involved, or the 3 or 4 people that were active getting sick of each other and the tension boiling over from disagreements because we were overworked.
Yeah, I think we saw pretty much the same thing on 11, 12, and 13, where the CSM had a pretty solid representation from all of the different groups in the game, but on the CSM and at the summit, that doesn't matter. It was not part of it at all.
I mean, CSM 8, obviously, if you know your history, ProGod and I don't get along, but there was no problem in the meetings. You would still shit talk each other outside the meetings, but generally in the meetings there was never any lack of it. But I would say this year, I'm just going to come out and say it straight away, Olmeca is destroying the relationships between the CSM members and between CSM and CCP with the way that he talks. I'm not even going to be nice about it. It is a definite shift this year compared to other years. I mean, Villy and I had our issues, and the reality was it never changed how it was in a meeting. We would have it out in private, not on a meeting. Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's a little bit of drama. It's all right. It's good. Dunk, you have been quiet. We haven't had a question to pitch to you, so I'm going to pitch one to you now. I'm not going to ask you about that because I don't want to put you on the spot, but You are CSM 14. This is your only CSM. You are not doing it again. Tell us what your impressions were coming in, what they are going out, what changed, and anything that you want to talk about, because you deserve some airtime.
You sure you don't want to talk about stuff from 10 years ago for a little while more?
Please do. Well, that would be great. Go right ahead.
Okay, just checking. I mean, everybody's up on like 2008 or whatever it is.
I will actually point in one little quick thing, because I think this is actually relevant to Dunk more than anybody. So historically, you used to see a lot of the CSM members used to post blogs about their meetings. They used to post, even meeting updates, status of this proposal, many other things, right? The NDA wasn't anywhere near as tight. Or it wasn't as tightly enforced, perhaps. And this CSM, Dunk has been the only one who's even endeavored to try and like dodge through that minefield to deliver anything back to people. And I think there's definitely some deserved shout out perhaps that should go to him for trying to, tell people things without being like, I don't want to get banned, please. It's a very delicate situation nowadays that I think Dunk deserves a little more credit for.
Well, that's what makes the relationship between CSM person and the group of people that elect them pretty interesting, because I think the one universal piece of feedback that everyone has provided so far is, if you come in with a laundry list of things you're looking to accomplish, or maybe promises that you've made, the odds of actually being able to deliver on any of that are incredibly low, because the company obviously has its own machinations that are playing out, and it's more interested in getting feedback on those. There's a really interesting question in chat that I thought was worth us bringing up maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago about what was it that actually created the more broad approach to interaction with the CSM? So instead of just maybe a GM or a community team person interacting with the CSM, why is it now that you have these teams marching in and out of the room? Now we'll talk to the brand team and the marketing team, and now we'll talk to this team that's working on live events, and this team that's talking about maybe new player things. And I don't know that it was necessarily like one disaster or another that created, or maybe an averted disaster that created this situation. I think that there really is just value to being able to test your idea with people outside of your own team or outside of the company. Because like everybody has said, it doesn't matter if you're the high sec candidate, or you're one of the null sec candidates, or you're a representative of wormholes or something like that. When you're sitting at the table, you're just offering the best advice that you possibly can related to the game, its health, and the function of the features that you're talking about. You're not like, well, as a candidate from nullsec, this is how I'm going to feel and opine about this particular feature. You're just a player that's played the game for a really long time, and you'd like to see it in the healthiest condition or state possible.
I think one thing to add to that is CCP always wants to listen to people. They want to listen to people. They want to, but they don't always act. They'll always be listening in the channels. We have so many different avenues of talking to different teams. They just don't always act on what we say.
So, Dunk, what was your experience this time on 14?
Well, most of you listening here hear what it's pretty much like about a lot of people talking about a lot of things. So that's supposed to be a joke, although Merc and Sword are not happy to hear it. So my experience was, it's what I expected. CCP is a business. These are basically business meetings. They have concerns about making money, retaining players, the press. Like, it's a business. And if you go in thinking you're hanging out with your buddies talking about cool stuff to do with spaceships for a week, you'll be sorely in the wrong place. It's business. This is an advisory group to the company. The CSM has no power to do anything. When people in forums or Reddit or whatever say, I can't believe the CSM let CCP do something, they just don't understand what the role is. So it's kind of what I expected. What I didn't expect is basically, in some places, whatever the CSM says, you could say CCP has solved cancer and has a vaccine, and then they would complain that you're going to put doctors out of work. So I think there's a certain contingent of players that don't think the CSM has any value, and you encounter them a lot more than I thought I would going into this.
Nam, so you've been on the last 4 CSMs. Of those 4, which one did you have the most fun on, and why was it CSM 13?
That was definitely having you around on CSM 13.
There you go, right answer. No, seriously though, so you were on 4. I think you and Sword have been on more than anybody else on the show. What changed? Did it feel different over the years? And how did it change for you as time went on?
So my first run on CSM 11, you go in there the first time, you have no idea what's going on. You don't know any of the people involved. So like your first summit is worthless. You're not getting anything done. You're just getting to know the people, how the company works, how to maneuver through that. But each summit and each run after that, you get to know the people, you get to know how things operate, you get to know what works and what doesn't, and it makes you much more effective as a CSM. And one piece of advice I would give to anyone thinking about running is, unless you're planning on running 2-3 years, don't. Like, if you're just going to run for 1 year, you're wasting your voters' time.
And that,
sorry, Duncan.
Well, for follow-up for that,
I tend to disagree, and the guys on the CSM know that I tend to disagree on this. I think you can come in and make an impact, but basically you have to kind of know who CCP is, and you have to have some relationships in advance, which means you've been a person in the community that speaking at events, things like that. So you definitely can come in and make an impact in your first year. But you can't come in cold where nobody knows who you are and that you don't know who the devs are and you don't understand the structure. You can't walk in and be successful. But if you've been a part of the wider community and participated in community events, gotten to know the devs at different events, you definitely can come in your first year and make a difference.
That's
I
a
think
fair
it's very
point.
ironic.
Just
because,
2 things to add.
Just real quick. I don't know
I
when
like this
exactly
one.
this shift happened. I think it was the double digits somewhere, but CSM used to have very few, if any, incumbents that would run term to term because we all got burnt out. A lot of folks in the early CSMs wound up quitting the game after their term, shortly thereafter their term. I had to take a little bit of a break after because I was just so overworked and so frustrated with the whole thing. So the idea of going in with the intention, knowing in advance you're going to run for multiple terms, is a very modern CSM thing and just unthinkable back when we were doing it.
Yeah, not that many people survived CSM 10, did they?
No, or 8, 9, 7, but who on 7 is still active? Like besides me, I think Hans Jagerblitzen's done. He was the other most active person.
I mean, that was the thing when I was looking at old CSMs, who's still around. And it's funny, Alec is one of the few from a pre-CSM 8 or 9 that's still around. Elise is still around. From my listings I mean, obviously Billy was on 2 as an alternate. ProGod's around. But you look back, a ton of these guys. Celine is still around, but he's not playing that much. You don't see him. Matani's still around. X-Death, I understand, is coming back to the game. But a lot of these guys, the Helen Highwaters and the Elven Lords and Ankh and Alpha and the ones that made up the old CSMs, they're just not in the game anymore. So we've lost a lot of that history, and that's why it's tough for me. I went back and did a ton of research. I was looking through all the old candidate threads and how things worked and everything, and you see all these names, and it's funny because you get this. I mean, the same ideas keep coming up over and over again, and they're still being talked about. I found a thread from CSM1, a petition proposal to put Logi on kill mails. I mean, that was 12 years ago, and we're still talking about it. It still hasn't happened yet. But go ahead.
2 things to add. One, this is more of an inside joke. I think Nom's favorite CSM was CSM 12, second summit. But then otherwise, I would say that Dunk is right. If you are coming in as a cold person that has not actually got to know CCP at all through other events, it's going to be very hard for you. But since the ages of CSM 8 and further on, if you have taken the time to get to know CCP at other places, you can definitely have an in for it. And I think you can be successful as a single like term CSM. The problem is that it's also what you grade as successful. Do you think you were successful, or do you think that you didn't do anything during that year? And that's the ultimate question.
All right, so I'm gonna do a round robin here real quick because we got about 10 minutes left in the show, and I do want to talk about a couple of CSM 15 things. We saw a couple of changes to the CSM coming up with the next elections. I think the two biggest things, I mean, obviously I think the biggest thing is going to be that everybody has to campaign now, which is nice. The second biggest thing, and I think, I don't know, I have a different opinion on this on some of you, so we're going to throw it out here. We'll do around the group. Typically, prior to this, there were 2 summits in Iceland. You did a summit in the wintertime, in September through December period, and then you did a summit in the springtime, January to March or April, before FanFest. So there were 2 summits. You got out there twice. And typically, at least in my experience, and I was only on one CSM, so I can't speak to the rest of you guys who've been on multiple, we had, the first summit was a chance for us to get to know each other and us to get to know the devs. And then the second summit, we were already there, we knew everybody, and I felt like it was a lot more productive the second term. There's only one summit now. What's your guys' take on that? I'll throw it to Merck first, and then we'll go around the room and talk about what we think. So, Merck, what's your take on limiting it from 2 CSM summits to 1?
I think the institution's really going to suffer as a result in its effectiveness. You would say, I think it would be conservative to say something like 95% of the work that a CSM accomplishes, things that you can look back on and say, you know what, this was an inflection point for us where we made a difference, our feedback made a difference. Happens at the summit. There's nothing like, marching up to Iceland, sitting down in the room, having the developers, kind of captive audience in the room together. So I think, unfortunately, this is moving the wrong direction with the best part of the CSM, unfortunately.
Jeremy, what's your take as a potential candidate? Are you deterred, or are you happy about the fact that there's only one summit?
I'm a little sad that there is only one summit. I've been low-key following the last few CSMs, and what really has stuck out to me is, it's not so much we advocate for this, but we're here to offer the best possible feedback. And that's something that kind of inspired me to run, because, hey, I've been a producer for 2.5 years. My job is to find the best part of Eve or the worst part of Eve and tell a story about it. And basically that our shows are feedback to CCP about what is going on. So my purpose is to find the best possible, put that feedback in the best possible way, and then tell a story about that. But yeah, I'm definitely very sad that it's only going to be one summit. I feel like that the interactions, following the summits on Twitter, or as best as I can, it seems like that's where the magic happens, and they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot, especially now that there are term limits and more people are going to be kind of churned through the CSM, and you're going to have a less opportunity to get to know one another and get to know the devs and all of that onboarding process.
We'll talk a little about term limits in a minute, but Nam, what's your take?
I think it's a mistake. Like Merck said, that's where all the big stuff happens. I think that there's sort of an additional part, which is that the 2 summits, that's a serious time commitment. It sort of sets a bar where if you want to run for CSM, you have to be serious about it. You can't just you have to decide to throw away 2 weeks of your vacation to run for CSM. And I think that the single term, or the single summit, opens it up to a lot of people who aren't going to take it seriously.
Dunk, what's your take?
I don't think it's the end of the world. I think 2 summits does work better, but I understand the concerns over having to and going to 1. I think you can compensate if we can improve the communication, the day-to-day communication between the CSM and the CCP, and get some more clarity about exactly what team is working on what. And maybe that's an anomaly for this year, but remember, this CSM came in the middle of Blackout just kicking off. It came in the middle of CCP doing a major reorganization of the way they do development. They've pivoted several times in this term of the CSM, and so getting that communication going is difficult to just know who do I talk to on a Wednesday when we need to talk about something, rather than waiting once a week. We might have an hour of a formal meeting on Slack. So I think it can work if we really increase the amount of day-to-day communication and clarity about what group's working on what.
Sort, how many actual summits did you end up going to? You were on 5 CSMs, but I don't think you went to every summit, right?
I think I went to 5 overall, I think.
And since you have to travel like 24 hours to get there, I'm sure you probably have a different take on the change than the rest of them, but what's your take on it?
No, I completely agree. It's worth the travel. The problem is it's very easy to ignore the CSM when you only have to see them face to face once a year as the CSM outside of player events. When you see them the first CSM summit, you can say these are the things that we think are problems with the player base right now, and CCP can say this is our plan. When you have one summit, you can then go away and pretty much, if you wanted to, ignore them for the rest of the year. Whereas if you have a second summit, after the 6 months has gone by since the first one, they can turn around to you and say, okay, so you told us this 6 months ago, how come we haven't seen movement on it? Why are your plans changing now? And I think this is a bad change, and I think it's specifically being made as a change to affect how much weight the CSM has at CCP.
Interesting. Alec, what's your take?
Yeah, I think Sort's spot on. The biggest value loss in my mind is the accountability factor. Maybe a bit more of a sore point for me because of how our CSMs and the summits for 4 and 7 ran, but the ability to sit down with them, talk through a plan, talk through some issues, and then have an in-person follow-up on that after some significant period of time where changes or plans could have been implemented. You can see what direction they're going. You can see which teams are honoring any commitments they may or may not have made. I think that's pretty huge. And going to one summit without a mechanism to address that potential issue, would definitely like to have seen that problem worked on in advance, because it's a fair risk given the history of the CSM and the tendency for it to be sidelined by the company. So I think those fears are pretty reasonable.
Billy, you get the last word, at least on this subject.
As far as this subject goes, I see both sides. I'm not sure which I'm personally in favor of. I think the massive time commitment that these summits are, trying to come up with a time to, interject 2 weeks of travel to Iceland for more business meetings into your life is not something that every person can do. And there's definitely the case that, that ensures you get good quality people who can do it. But it also doesn't necessarily ensure that you just don't end up with people who have free time. Regardless of what has happened, there was almost certainly only going to be one summit this year anyways because of Corona. So if, the summit next year for CSM 15 happens and people feel that it just wasn't enough, it wasn't working, then certainly we're in a situation where the damage can probably be undone in a summit or two if it's possible. Regardless, it's CCP's call to make, I guess.
Well, I would like to think that, given the fact that we have 5 candidates on, we have 8 people, and 7 of whom have been on past CSMs, and pretty much to a person, everybody thinks the one summit idea is a bad idea, that might be something they'd be willing to look at. But obviously the virus is gonna impact everything, and it's way too early for us to even be talking about summits when half the world's still on lockdown and we're not traveling at all. I'm growing a beard because I haven't left my house since March 12th, so I'm still trying to wrap my brain around the new normal.
That's not the reason.
Well, I'm lazy. I like being able to work from home. It's nice. Get to hang out with the dog and the kid during the day. term limits is an issue. That's another thing that's added this time around. I've said this before. It's funny that we're talking about it because I look back. If you read the original white paper that created the CSM and CSM 1, they had term limits. You could be elected 2 times overall in any capacity. You could be on 2 CSMs. That was it. I don't know when they changed that. It kind of just stopped being a thing. And we saw, as of CSM 4 and 5, we had people that had multiple terms. So at some point that was altered. The way that the term limits are set up now, it's set up as you can be on for 3 years and consecutively between, then you have to take a break of at least a year, and then you can be on for another 3 years. And that's it. And they grandfathered everybody else in. All you guys, Nam and Merc and Villy, will have 1 year talent against you, even though you guys have been on more than one. But that's it. To me, that's not exactly term limits, because other than Steve Renukin, who's in the chat, and Nam now with 4 and Sort being a replacement a bunch of times, there aren't a lot of people that are on like 7 or 8 or 6 or 7 CSMs, especially not in a row. It's really, really difficult to do. So what's your guys' take? And I'll just throw it open to whoever wants to talk. What's your guys' take on the term limits thing? Do you think that's going to matter?
I don't think it's as controversial as the summit thing at all. I think the way that they're implementing it, regardless of which side you find yourself, is pretty fair. And I think groups that like to have some continuity in their representation are going to be able to work around it. But I just don't. This one's not going to be quite such a hot button, I don't think, as the summits, at least in my opinion.
Most people burn out after 3 years as well, to be honest.
That seems to be about right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's 5 o'clock. We have reached the end of the show. I think we've covered pretty much everything. I wanted to, if we had time, I was going to do a Nullsec Power Hour to talk about some of the fights this week, but I think Mittens and I can probably cover that next week. But I do want to thank everybody for being here. Villy, Alex, Sort, Dunk, and Aminet, and obviously the co-host Merc and January. Guys, thanks for joining. Anybody want to say anything at the end of the show very quickly, and then I'll wrap it up? All right.
January Valentine's.
Everyone should go on.
There you go. Go ahead.
Everyone should go onto the forums and tweet about it that you want T2 salvage drones.
There you go. It's on my list. It is on my list on the website. All right, everybody. I want to thank everybody for. What'd you say, Sort? Go ahead.
Don't vote for Omeka. There are better people out there. If you hate goons, there are better people than Omeka.
There you go. Hey, nice pay. You got a CSM 14 challenge coins. That's pretty good. All right, guys, thank you very much. I'd like to thank January, our producer, Merkel Chen, who was co-host along with me today. I want to thank Jay Amazingness, who is one of our other producers. And just in case you guys were wondering, yes, I am gay for Jay. Skeptic Nerd Guy, Life Shifter X, as well as our other producers. Thank you all for joining us on the Meta Show, and we will see you next week.